My presentation is about a pitch to this room of business development, alliance management experts on maximizing the value through product launch. So perhaps something that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but there are things that you can do and think about as you go through the deal-making process that could truly add value to the product once that deal is consummated and that product is eventually launched. But to start, I want to ask a simple question, which is what you think the most important factor is for product success. So Augustina, if we can switch to the Slido, please. So I wanted to add a couple different options. So if you'd like, you're welcome to get out your phone, or perhaps we can take a look at the results later. But in terms of what's the most important factor for a successful launch, perhaps a couple things came to mind. Perhaps the structure of the deal. So a lot of the presentations so far have been about having the right deal and the right way and the right structure. Could be internal launch execution, which will be a lot of what I'll be talking about. So adding value to the deal through that internal launch capability. Third could be the environmental factors. So reimbursements, government affairs, patient advocacy, how important that drug is to the environment. And then a little bit further down that you can't quite see could also be simply the product itself, the efficacy, safety, et cetera profile. So interesting just to get a sense of what we do see. I do believe at the end of the day that they're all quite important factors. So if we switch back to the slides, please. Thank you very much. I have a lot of experience in product launch over the course of my career. So I've worked with launches on the big pharma side, biotech side, startup. I've worked in multiple disease areas, including from diabetes to oncology, neurology, and so forth. So I just want to share some of the things that I thought would really be important in terms of preparing for a successful product launch. So I kind of want to start with, so if I ask my grandmother, what makes a successful launch? And she might simply say, doesn't the product simply sell itself? If it's a good product, it shouldn't sell. But I think we all know that it's more complicated than that. And in fact, looking through a couple of management consulting reports from McKinsey, Deloitte, and others, it's really quite shocking that almost 2/3 miss the year one sales target. So if you look at what analysts expect and what ultimately comes through in terms of that first year of sales, it truly, the majority of product launches do miss that target. And then about 50% overall miss the analysts' expectations for launch. So we know that there's something more than just putting the right deal together, that launch execution is crucially important. So when I think about what makes a successful product launch, I think about three fundamental pieces. The first is creating the right strategy. And so when you're thinking about that deal and how that deal should be brought in, that you also have to think about what's the right strategic pillars for executing that launch in the market. How do you maximize value for a varied set of stakeholders? It's not simply just patients and physicians these days. There are also advocacy groups, many other stakeholders, payers, for example, that all contribute to the overall value that that product creates. Second would be executing a best-in-class launch. So this is something I'm quite passionate about. So what are the industry-leading capabilities to ensure that you're extracting as much value as possible from a given launch? And then finally, I think what really differentiates a good launch from a great launch is a winning mindset. So you can tell this by looking at the team. So we'd already heard about hiring the right people, bringing on the right people. But in the middle of a launch, when you're working nights and weekends and the whole team has been, kind of burning the candle at both ends for 2 years, what is that winning mindset? Do they truly believe in what they're doing? And that can really differentiate a launch. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the first part. So creating the right foundational strategy. So I believe there are a couple components of this that are really, really important. So first, it's incredibly simple. Can we align all of our stakeholders on a singular narrative? So as an example, I was listening to an earnings call the other day for a pharma that had a product coming up in phase 3. It's very important to the company. CEO says, great, it's a great product, efficacy, efficacy, efficacy. Messages all on efficacy. Chief Scientific Officer comes up. Safety, safety, safety. Great safety profile. Then comes the CFO. It's also incredibly convenient. The patient's going to have a great experience. And they, in that room, might have felt, wow, we really delivered all of these messages. To me, I was confused. What is that product? What really matters? We have to avoid falling into the trap that the product meets everyone's demands, and it's everything to everyone and every patient. That's a common trap. So you need a singular narrative that everyone has internally and externally. Secondly, answering the right strategic questions. There are many questions that are not particularly important during the BD or the alliance development process. Having and making sure they're answering the right strategic questions is absolutely essential. You have to nail the positioning. I would argue that this is developed up front. I think once you're in the launch execution process, you are refining that, but ultimately that positioning should feed into the deal valuation. I think it's got to be figured out up front. And then finally, if you have time, think about the patient journey. Think about where your company will add value over the course of the patient journey. I want to come back to those one by one. So on the narrative piece, so there's hopefully a scientific narrative, an extensive deck or so that underlines all the different aspects of the drug, efficacy, safety, and so forth. But having a narrative has to be consistent, and it feeds both external and internal stakeholders. So on the external side, you want to be able to say the same thing to investor relations, in congresses and your presence in congresses, through your medical field. But you also want to have an internal narrative that is consistent. All the executives are saying the same thing to the same audiences. And then even think about people that you bring onto the company to help launch that product. You want to inspire them with the same talking points and make sure it's consistent. And it can be incredibly simple. It could be one slide. It could be one slide. So if you think about it, you need to clearly state the unmet need, what your product will address, your level of investment, and your commercial aspirations. So what does that mean? We're intending to address XYZ unmet need, which is not currently met. We think this product is great because of XYZ. By investment, perhaps it's the largest phase 3 study or it's an innovative phase 3 study, whatever your level of commitment is to that asset. And then ultimately, what are your commercial aspirations? We think this will be a leading product, for example. One singular narrative for everyone to use. I mentioned answering the right strategic questions. So perhaps by a show of hands, has anybody read Playing to Win? It's a classic book. I'd highly recommend it. So we use a framework called Where to Play, How to Win. And if you haven't heard that before, it's a very kind of core consulting concept we use across many industries, but certainly applies in product launch in pharmaceutical and biotech. Asking key strategic questions. Where to play, so what patient types, what HCP segments, what is the treatment journey going to look like, and where do we add value? And then how to win. What behavioral changes will we try to influence? How will we try to differentiate, which is absolutely essential. So these are the types of things that you can be thinking about as you go into the deal-making process to kind of be a precursor to what will ultimately be the launch execution. And then I was trying to think about this audience. Is there anything specific that I would also say to this particular audience here at PharmaSynergy? Two things that I would avoid answering too early. One, which would be, how much do we invest in specific launch capabilities? I hear it's almost one of the first questions that's asked. I've been in the deal-making process, and someone's asked me, and it feels like it's very early that it comes up, and yet we really need to build in some of these other strategic questions before we can answer how much of an investment we need to make. And then also things like how big of a field force do we need? That'll come. I would say save that till later on in the process. I mentioned nailing the positioning. Also could be incredibly simple. Think about your 3x3 of what the market looks like. Think about where your product should play. So, just putting up an easy schematic here of a current disease activity levels for a certain patient population and a certain disease area, and then what stage of the disease that they're at as a patient. So where are your priority areas that you think the asset will play and win? Where perhaps are secondary areas that you may come into after a couple of years of launch, and what are non-priority areas? So knowing that up front is really, really important. I think when you think about positioning, a couple of areas to try to avoid is that sometimes we'll think about positioning in terms of the market today. But in many cases, the product won't launch for a couple of years in the future. So you have to think about what the future environment will look like for product launch. Try to understand and quantify what the potential area is in each of those boxes, and then also understand who else is winning there, either companies or assets that are playing in those boxes and who you will be competing with. And then finally, if you have time, think about the patient journey. So there's a bit of an eye chart, but throughout the course of the patient journey, you want to find the areas that you can maximize value. So that was number one, nailing the narrative, having the right strategic questions, having the right positioning, and if you have time for it, where do you plan to add value? So whether you love him or hate him, Elon Musk is a true innovator. We all know this. Many industries that he's disrupted, and he's brought some very interesting thinking along the way. So I want to bring that here to say, as business development, alliance management folks, consider yourself the design engineers. You're designing the deal. You are the ones who are creating what the deal ultimately becomes. But think about the launch team as the production team, the ones that will be manufacturing the launch. And so one of the things that Elon's done, both at SpaceX as well as Tesla, is that he has brought the design engineers much closer to the production team. And so as an example, and I love this quote, he said to the design engineer at SpaceX, "You are responsible for the production process. You can't hand it off to someone else. If the design is expensive to produce or doesn't work, you change the design." And then he moved 75 design people from their desks, wherever they were, to the production line. And so when I think about your involvement beyond the deal, continue to try to stay with it. Stay in touch with the execution team that's launching the product and bring through some of those things and decisions that were made part of the deal-making process, because that ultimately will help it to really maximize the most value. So talking a bit more about launch execution. So again, a couple of statistics from the management consulting world, you really have about 6 months for success with a launch. I actually, from my experience, would say this is more 9 to 12 months. Sometimes there can be a bit of a slow burn at the beginning, but you really do not have time to make it a successful launch. And truly, only about 20% of launches are able to change the uptake curve. If your curve is going like this and you expect it to be like this, it's very, very hard to change that curve, particularly after the first 6 to 12 months. And so it's absolutely essential to be able to get off to the best possible start you can. So when we think about executing a best-in-class launch, there's a couple things that I want you to keep in mind. One, developing a launch plan, but not just any launch plan. A launch plan that is focused on creating value. Value for payers as much as value for patients as well as HCPs. Structure an agile launch team, so we'll talk just for a brief amount about governance. Measuring the right metrics, so we hadn't quite talked too much about KPIs, but I want to talk about that for a moment. And when you think about this launch plan, so prepare the environment, prepare the product, and prepare the organization is a fairly well-used, generic framework for how you think about launch readiness. But within all of these different deliverables, within all of these functional areas and cross-functional areas, you really need to focus on where the most value will be created. And that value will ultimately be rewarded in terms of the uptake of the product as well as the price that you might be able to get from payers. When you think about governance, I like to think about a structure. This is one of my favorite structures for launch governance, whereby at the bottom levels, really where the execution is happening, you have strong partnerships. In my last launch experience, we had a strong partnership between our global team and the US team, which was the biggest market at the time. And so you can really think about how you'd mix and match that, but for different particular areas, so patient engagement, launch strategy, launch insights, to really have strong partnerships at that level to be able to execute. I've actually started to move away from functional teams. I think a lot of the launch teams are set up where there's a supply representative, there's a regulatory. If you really try to mix them together, it really brings that cross-functional element. And ensuring that the team is empowered, accountable, partnering with the key markets and driven to win, I think is all absolutely essential, while empowering the launch leads to be able to drive the launch through. When I would say, again, for this particular room, what you should keep in mind when you think about this governance for a launch, a couple things. So make sure that you include the right company stakeholders. So I've seen certain situations where there's a lot of senior level people in the room, but perhaps too senior. You really need the people who are also executing the launch to be part of that governance structure. You also need to make sure that there's global alignment on key decisions and that there's a tight operational pull-through, which is absolutely essential and would seem quite obvious. Just on KPIs, it's also quite interesting. I feel like I'm the marketer in the room when I'm asking these questions during a due diligence. I'm part of a due diligence now, and I'm very interested in knowing, sure, not just the asset and the strategy for the deal, but what are the current pre-launch KPIs for this particular asset? So you'd ask, well, we're in a pre-sales situation, so what KPIs would you look at? For a given asset, do HCPs believe in the unmet need that the asset will deliver? Are they aware that the asset even exists? If they do, what is their perception of the product? And then go ahead, be bold. Ask what the likelihood is that they're going to adopt that product at launch or 6 months post-launch. I think that is extremely informative. Sometimes we get into our own boxes and we think this drug is going to be amazing, but until you test these types of KPIs in the market, to truly understand that potential, you don't really know. So at the end of the day, a launch plan focused on value, structuring an agile launch team, and making sure that you're looking at the right metrics. The last one is really quick. So I mentioned about having a winning mindset. I truly believe that this is something that can set a launch apart, whether it is a good launch to a great launch. It's one where everyone truly feels that there's a sense of purpose. There's a sense of urgency, that what they need to deliver will deliver a unique set of values to patients that will improve their lives, that will lengthen their lives, etc. So if you have that belief in the team, they will work harder and they will make sure that they are more committed than you would if you hadn't otherwise. Agility, accountability, collaboration, I think that goes without saying, but it's something that you have to keep in mind as you kind of govern the overall launch. And then avoiding burnout by mixing in some fun. So, I want to mention this point because this is a really high burn type of situation when you're launching a product, and that it's easy to kind of lose track of where you are. So when you think about simple things to mix things up, ask the team, host a meeting outside. Why not? Let's take a day, and instead of working on the strategy, let's go take a climb to a mountain. The other thing I'd also mention is that every milestone, when you're thinking about a launch, even when the announcement is made publicly and then you move into the launch execution process, key milestones should be celebrated. You have the brand name. Congratulations. Hold an event. You've just rolled out an unmet needs campaign. Congratulations. Hold a company-wide event. Make a big deal as if this is the biggest deal for the company and the biggest deal for the company's future. And that will really garner the attention of everyone. The last minute that I want to spend in my presentation was I was asked organizational capabilities for launch. Which organizational capabilities are increasingly more important in today's launch environment and which are decreasingly important in today's launch environment? So on increasingly important, which capabilities are increasingly important in today's environment? There's a couple that come to mind. Price and access, incredibly important. So when you're looking at deals to make, what that price will be is absolutely essential, particularly in the US and certainly in the EU5 and other key markets. So the price that product can command is probably even more important than it has been 10 years ago. Omni-channel engagement is also incredibly important. We know that we can't just do simple marketing these days. How we're going to touch HCPs from multiple different channels is important. Cross-functional teams, I think we heard from one of the other presentations earlier as well. Working cross-functionally is essential. We can't just work in silos anymore. And then artificial intelligence. This is the buzzword of the day, the year, what have you. But integrating artificial intelligence, whether it be on the research and development side, but certainly in the marketing commercial capability side, is a real opportunity. And then on capabilities that I feel are decreasingly important, I would say first, large field teams. So we'd heard today the increasing focus on specialty. So you don't really need these primary care large field teams. And so that's something that is decreasingly important. There's also opportunities for virtual field people to interact with HCP, so it's just not as important as it used to be. Undifferentiated mass marketing, I think we just went through a period where, hey, we'll just put the money in and see what happens. It doesn't make sense. The field is too noisy. There's too many messages going in too many places. It doesn't make sense. Things about search engine optimization, social media spend are much better bets than they are versus undifferentiated mass marketing, which to me is a bit of a waste of money. And then finally, outdated launch excellence training. So I feel like we just went through that here today, but if you'd gone through this perhaps 10 years ago, some underlying principles still apply, but ultimately so many things have changed in today's environment that you need to be able to keep up to where the environment is to maximize launch. So my closing thoughts are, thanks. Hopefully I was able to convince you that in business development, alliance management, that it does make sense to think about certain things during the deal-making process that could be carried through with the launch, and hopefully you continue to stay involved in the launch even after the deal is made. So thank you very much for the opportunity.